She didn't scream. She didn't beg. Martha Caldwell just sat in the dirt outside her father's ranch, dust on her cheeks, her dress torn at the shoulder, and her eyes fixed on nothing like a woman who had already made peace with disappearing. That was the moment Ethan Cole pulled his horse to a stop. Not because she asked, because something in the silence was louder than any cry he'd ever heard. If this story speaks to your heart, subscribe to our channel. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1880 had no mercy in it. The heat pressed down on the New Mexico territory like a hand flat against your chest. Not enough to kill you outright, just enough to remind you every single minute that the land didn't care whether you lived or died. The road between Mesilla and the Caldwell Ranch was nothing but cracked earth and white dust and the occasional skeleton of a mesquite bush, too stubborn to fall over. Even the vultures had found shade somewhere. Ethan Cole had been riding since before sunrise. He wasn't a man who explained himself, not even to himself. He rode because stopping felt worse. He took jobs when he needed money and moved on when the job was done, and in between he kept his mouth shut and his eyes forward and tried not to think about the kind of man he used to be before he decided that version of himself wasn't worth keeping. That was enough of a life. It had been enough for 7 years. His horse, a dark bay gelding named Cord, moved at an easy walk. Ethan didn't push him in this heat. The animal had more sense than most men he'd known, and Ethan respected that. He was thinking about nothing in particular. The water trough in Mesilla, maybe a meal that wasn't jerky when he heard it. Not a scream, not a shout, something quieter than that. Something that cut straight through the heat and the silence and lodged itself in the center of his chest before he even understood what he'd heard. A woman crying. Not the kind of crying that asks for an audience. The kind that happens when a person believes no one is listening. Low and ragged and completely without hope. Cord's ears flicked back. Then forward. Ethan pulled the reins without thinking. He turned his head toward the sound and saw maybe 40 yards off the road. A ranch property, a main house, a barn, a water trough, 2 horses tied at the post. And on the ground beside the porch steps, sitting in the dirt, like she'd been put there and forgotten, was a young woman. She was heavy-set, full-figured in a way that her dress, plain blue cotton practical not made for company, did nothing to hide. Her dark hair had come half loose from its pins and stuck to her face in the heat. Her shoulder seam was torn. There was dust on her cheek and on her hands and on the front of her dress, and she was sitting with her knees pulled slightly to the side, arms wrapped around herself, looking at the ground with the expression of someone who has stopped expecting the world to do anything other than disappoint them. Standing above her one boot on the bottom porch step was a man in his 50s, broad, well-fed. The kind of man whose authority came from land ownership and had never once been seriously questioned. He wasn't yelling. He was smiling, which was somehow worse. "You'll come around," the man was saying, pleasant as a Sunday sermon. "Girls like you always do." The woman didn't answer. The man glanced up and noticed Ethan on the road. His smile didn't change. "Keep riding, stranger," he said. Easy, unbothered. The tone of a man who had never had a reason to be nervous about another man's presence. "Private property." Ethan didn't move. He sat on Cord and looked at the woman on the ground, and he waited. He didn't know what he was waiting for. Some signal from his own judgment, maybe. Some reason to do what the sensible part of him was already telling him to do, which was ride on and mind his own business and not involve himself in something that would cost him time and trouble, and possibly more. Then the woman looked up. She didn't call out to him, didn't reach toward him, didn't do a single thing to ask for his help. She just looked at him with dark eyes that were wet at the edges, and what he saw in those eyes wasn't desperation. It was exhaustion. Complete, total, bone-deep exhaustion. The kind that comes not from one hard day, but from years of hard days stacked on top of each other until they've become the only weight a person knows how to carry. And underneath that exhaustion, barely visible, barely alive, something else. Something that hadn't quit yet, though it had every reason to. Ethan stepped down off his horse. "Mr. The man on the porch said, his voice dropping the pleasantness. "I told you, keep riding." "I heard you." Ethan looped Cord's reins over the fence post and walked toward the porch at an unhurried pace. "I'm just having some trouble doing it." The man on the porch straightened up. He was bigger than Ethan, broader, thicker through the chest. He had the look of someone who had used that size to settle arguments his whole life. "You got business here?" "Not yet," Ethan said. He stopped a few feet from the porch and looked down at the woman. Up close, she looked younger than he'd first thought. 20, maybe 22. Her hands were shaking slightly where they gripped her own arms. "Ma'am," he said. "You all right?" She looked up at him. Something moved across her face. Not hope, exactly, more like surprise. Like the question itself was something she hadn't been asked in a while. "She's fine," the man said sharply. "I'm asking her," Ethan said without looking at the man. A silence settled over the yard. The kind of silence that has weight to it. The woman's jaw tightened. She drew a breath. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was steady. That surprised him. "You don't look fine," Ethan said just as quietly. "You look like you've been sitting in the dirt a while." Her chin lifted. "It's my father's dirt." "Who tore your dress?" The man on the porch moved one step down, boot hitting the ground hard. "Now you listen here." "I'm listening to her," Ethan said. He still hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't touched his gun. He hadn't done anything that could reasonably be called a threat. But something in the flatness of his tone, something in the way he stood, shoulders loose, feet planted completely at ease, made the man on the porch stop. The woman on the ground looked at Ethan for a long moment. "It got caught on the fence," she said finally. It was a lie. He could see that. So could everyone present. Ethan nodded slowly, like he was accepting the answer. "Your name, ma'am?" She hesitated. "Martha. Martha Caldwell." "Miss Caldwell." He tipped his hat brief and unhurried. "My name's Ethan Cole. I'm passing through to Messia." He paused. "You need any help getting up?" She stared at him, like the offer itself required some kind of decoding. "I can get up on my own," she said. "All right." He stepped back and gave her the room to do it. She got her feet under her and pushed herself to standing, and she did it without asking for a hand. Though it was slow, and she swayed once in the heat. Her dress fell back around her, and she straightened it with the careful dignity of someone who understood that dignity was the only thing currently available to her. "Harold!" The voice came from inside the house. The screen door swung open and a man appeared. Older, thinner, wearing the particular expression of a man who had spent his whole life calculating how to survive. "What's going on out here?" The man on the porch. Harold apparently turned to look at the newcomer, and something in his posture shifted. Not quite deference, but awareness. "Nothing, William. Stranger was just passing through. This is your property," Ethan said to the older man. The man called William Caldwell looked Ethan over with quick, practiced eyes. He was the kind of man who assessed people the way other men assessed livestock: value, usefulness, potential cost. "It is," William said. "William Caldwell. And you'd be Ethan Cole. You got business in this county, Mr. Cole?" "Looking for work. Heard there were ranches hiring along this stretch." William Caldwell's eyes moved to his daughter standing in the yard. Something crossed his face. Not guilt. Not exactly. More like the look of a man who sees a problem he thought was contained and discovers it has expanded slightly. "Martha," he said, "go inside." "Yes, sir," she said. She walked toward the porch steps without looking at Ethan again. But at the door for just a fraction of a second she paused, and he saw her hand tighten on the doorframe. Then she was gone. Harold Vance watched her go with the patient expression of a man who has already decided the matter is settled and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. "We're not hiring," William Caldwell said to Ethan. "All right." Ethan looked at the door Martha had gone through. Then he looked at Harold Vance. Who is he? He said, nodding toward the larger man. Vance's eyebrows went up. He wasn't used to being referred to in the third person while standing 4 feet away. Harold Vance, William said with the careful tone of a man navigating something. Neighbor, family friend. Is he the one who tore her dress? Ethan said. The silence this time was of a different quality entirely. Mr. Cole. William said, his voice going flat and hard. I think you've made a wrong turn somewhere. The road to Messia is that way. Ethan looked at the man for a long moment. I reckon I'll water my horse before I go, he said. He spent 30 minutes at the trough letting Cord drink slow, long enough to let the silence in the yard settle. Long enough that Harold Vance, after glaring at him from the porch for a while, went back inside. Long enough that he could see through the side window of the main house the shadow of a woman moving in what was probably the kitchen. He wasn't sure what he was doing. That was the honest answer, if he'd been the kind of man who gave honest answers to himself. He didn't have business here. He didn't know these people. A woman sitting in the dirt in the summer heat was not strictly speaking his concern. There were probably 10 reasonable explanations for everything he'd seen that didn't require him to stand around getting in people's business. He didn't believe any of them. He remounted Cord and turned toward the gate, and he had nearly made it back to the road when he heard the screen door open behind him. Mr. Cole, he turned. Martha Caldwell was standing on the bottom porch step, a tin cup in each hand. She'd fixed her hair. Her face was composed, careful, giving nothing away. She crossed the yard toward him at a steady walk, and when she got close enough to hand him the cup, she looked him directly in the eyes for the first time. Water, she said, for the road. Thank you, ma'am. He took the cup. She stood there while he drank, and he had the sense that she was watching the road, not him. You should keep going, she said quietly, when he handed the cup back. Harold Vance doesn't like witnesses. Is that what you're worried about? He said. Me. Her jaw tightened. I'm not worried about anything. I'm being practical. What happens when I leave? She looked at him then, really looked at him for a second that lasted longer than it should have. Same thing that was going to happen before you got here, she said. He felt the words land, felt them settle somewhere in his chest with the weight of something much heavier than their syllables. And what is that? He said. She shook her head just slightly. Nothing you need to concern yourself with, Mr. Cole. What if I want to concern myself with it? The question surprised her. He could see it, the small pause, the flicker behind her eyes. She covered it quickly, but not quite fast enough. Why would you? She said, and the question was genuine. Not coy, not testing him. She actually didn't understand. He thought about that for a moment. Because you looked up at me, he said, and you didn't ask for help, and somehow that was worse than if you had. Something moved across her face that she didn't manage to hide in time. I don't need a stranger's charity, she said. I'm not offering charity. He looked back at the house. What's Vance to your family? She was quiet for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, very carefully, like she was choosing words out of a pile and setting others aside. He wants to marry me. My father has agreed to terms. And you? Her chin came up. My opinion wasn't requested. 3 seconds of silence. When? Ethan said. End of the month. 12 days. He did the math without wanting to. Miss Caldwell. Don't. Her voice was sharp, brief, controlled. Don't say whatever you're about to say. Don't make me a problem you picked up on the road. I've lived here my whole life. I know what's available to me and what isn't, and sympathy from a passing stranger isn't on that list. She straightened her back. Drink your water and go, Mr. Cole. Please. He handed the empty cup back to her. He looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. He rode out the gate. He made it 2 miles. That was as far as he got before Cord began to slow, without being asked, as if the horse too understood that something had been left unfinished. Ethan stopped at a ridge overlooking a shallow creek bed dried out now in the summer heat, and he sat there in the white hot afternoon and thought about Martha Caldwell's eyes, and Harold Vance's boot on the porch step, and the careful way she'd said my opinion wasn't requested, like she'd learned to say it without breaking, and that was the most heartbreaking part of it. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself he didn't do this kind of thing anymore, didn't get involved, didn't pick up other people's troubles and carry them down the road. He'd made that decision a long time ago, back when he'd finally understood that the cost of caring about strangers was a thing that added up faster than a man expected and left him bankrupt in ways that had nothing to do with money. He was still telling himself all of this when he turned Cord around. He rode back to Mesilla and went straight to the land office. The county recorder was a thin man named Atkins, who wore spectacles on the very end of his nose and had the tired, ink-stained look of someone who had spent decades watching other people argue over dirt. "Caldwell property," Ethan said when Atkins looked up. "William Caldwell. What can you tell me about it?" Atkins blinked. "Sir, that's not public." Ethan set a coin on the counter. Atkins looked at the coin, then at Ethan. Then he reached under the counter for a ledger. "Caldwell Ranch," he said, running a finger down a column. 640 acres established 1867. Currently, he paused. "Behind on the county water assessment, and there's a lien here." He leaned closer to the page. "Filed 6 months ago. Harold Vance claimant." "How much?" Ethan said. Atkins told him. It was enough to lose a ranch over. It was exactly the kind of number that would make a man decide his daughter's unhappiness was an acceptable price. He took a room at the boarding house in Mesilla. He ate a meal that was better than jerky. He lay on a bed that was barely long enough for him and stared at the ceiling and listened to the street noise outside, and thought with the particular clarity that comes after sundown about what kind of man he was. Not the man he'd been. That man was gone. But this man, the one he'd spent 7 years making himself into this man, had rules. Don't start trouble. Don't carry other people's weight. Don't get tangled up in things that will cost you more than you can pay. This man had ridden 2 miles, then turned around. That told him something. He turned on his side and looked at the wall, and he thought about Martha Caldwell sitting in the dirt with her arms wrapped around herself and her eyes fixed on nothing. And he thought about the way she'd said same thing that was going to happen before you got here. Like his presence had changed. Nothing would change nothing. And she had already accepted that. He didn't believe that. He didn't know why he didn't believe it. He had no reason to trust his own instincts about a woman he'd spoken to for maybe 5 minutes in the dust and heat outside her father's ranch. But something in the way she'd held herself, the careful control, the chin up, the refusal to ask, told him that what looked like surrender on the surface was something else underneath. Something that hadn't given up yet, no matter how much it had every reason to. He'd seen that quality in very few people in his life. The ones he had seen it in had always mattered. He made himself a simple list the way he did when he was trying to think straight. Harold Vance held a lien on the Caldwell property. William Caldwell had agreed to give his daughter to Vance almost certainly in exchange for the debt being forgiven. Martha Caldwell had 12 days. She had told him to leave. She hadn't told him she didn't want help. She'd told him help wasn't available. Those were different things. He wasn't sure exactly what he was going to do. He didn't have a plan. He had a direction, which was back toward the Caldwell Ranch in the morning, and a single clear intention, which was that Harold Vance was not going to get what he wanted without someone saying out loud and on record that the woman in question had not consented. It wasn't much, but it was something. And something in Ethan Cole's experience was where everything started. He was back at the Caldwell gate by 7 the next morning. William Caldwell came out of the house alone and stood on the porch and watched Ethan dismount with the look of a man who had been expecting this but was not pleased about being right. "Mr. Cole," he said. "I thought I made it clear." "You're losing the ranch," Ethan said. That stopped him. "I beg your pardon. The lien Vance filed 6 months ago, the water assessment you're behind on." Ethan walked toward the porch unhurried. You're about to lose everything your family built, and Vance knows it, which is why he's not in a hurry. He knows you don't have options." William Caldwell's face had gone through several colors and settled on something between pale and dangerous. "That," he said, "is a private financial matter." "Your daughter is not a financial instrument," Ethan said. "You have no right." "What does she know about the lien?" Silence. Ethan watched the man's face. "She doesn't know," he said. It wasn't a question. William Caldwell's jaw tightened. "She doesn't need to. She doesn't know the real reason. She just thinks her father agreed to sell her." Ethan paused. "Does she know you're not doing it out of cruelty, that you're doing it because you're desperate?" The silence was answer enough. "Tell her," Ethan said. "That's not your... She deserves to know the whole truth." He held the man's eyes. "Even if the truth doesn't change what you're planning to do." William Caldwell stared at him for a long moment. His hands were at his sides. He was 60 or close to it, a working man with working man's hands, and in his face, Ethan could see something that wasn't quite guilt, but was adjacent to it. The look of a man who had told himself a certain story about his own choices, and was finding that story harder to maintain under observation. The screen door opened. Martha stood in the doorway. She looked at her father, then at Ethan, then back at her father. "What's happening?" she said. "Nothing," William said quickly. "Mr. Cole was just leaving." "Mr. Cole?" Martha said. "Why did you come back?" Ethan looked at her. "Because you told me things were going to happen whether I was here or not," he said. "And I decided I'd rather be here than not." Something moved through her expression that she didn't manage to flatten in time. "You don't know anything about my situation," she said. "I know about the lien," he said. She went very still. "I know about the water assessment. I know what Vance is holding over your father." He looked at her directly. "Did you know?" Her eyes moved to her father. The question in them wasn't accusation, not yet. It was the look of someone doing arithmetic that wasn't adding up. "Papa," she said quietly. William Caldwell looked at his daughter, and in his face, Ethan saw the specific devastation of a man confronting the moment he has run out of places to hide. "Martha." "How much?" she said. The words were quiet, precise. The voice of a woman who had learned to be very careful with her emotions because the world had never given her a safe place to spend them. "Martha, it's more complicated than..." "How much, Papa?" he told her. She received the number without flinching. Her face didn't collapse. Her eyes didn't fill. She just stood there in the doorway in the early morning heat and took that number into herself and went somewhere private with it. And when she came back, her expression was composed, and her chin was level, and she was looking at her father with something in her eyes that wasn't anger. It was worse than anger. It was grief. "So Harold Vance owns us already," she said, "and marrying me is how he collects. He would forgive the debt. He's buying me," she said. "Call it what it is." William Caldwell closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked like a man who had aged somewhere behind the eyes while they were shut. "I don't have another way," he said. "Martha, I have looked at every..." "I know," she said. And she did somehow. She knew her father was not a cruel man. She knew he was a man who had run out of road. That understanding made it worse and better at the same time. "I know, Papa." She looked at Ethan. "Why did you tell me this?" she said. "Because you deserve to know," he said. "And because knowing changes what your choices are." "I don't have choices," she said. "You might have more than you think," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The summer heat pressed down on all of them. Somewhere in the barn a horse moved and knocked against a stall. A dove called once from the fence post and went quiet. "What are you proposing, Mr. Cole?" she said at last. Not suspicious, not hopeful, just asking, with the careful precision of a woman who had learned not to assume anything. He met her eyes. "I'm not sure yet," he said honestly. "But I'd like to try to figure it out, if you're willing." Another silence. She was still looking at him when the dust cloud appeared on the road to the east, and they all turned to watch Harold Vance's wagon come rolling up the drive early and unannounced, the way a man rides who has decided that waiting is no longer necessary. Martha Caldwell turned from the wagon and looked at Ethan Cole. And for the first time, she didn't look like a woman who had already decided nothing could change. She looked like a woman deciding. Harold Vance didn't knock. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. The man climbed down from his wagon, handed his reins to nobody, just dropped them over the post like the world was his hitching rail, and walked straight toward the porch without slowing, without announcing himself, without doing any of the things a man does when he understands that he is a guest on someone else's property. He walked like a man who had already bought the place and was simply waiting for the deed to catch up. "William." He nodded at Caldwell. Then his eyes moved to Martha, and something in them shifted. Not warmth, not affection. Something more like inventory. Martha. Then they moved to Ethan, and they went flat and still and very cold. "Who's this?" "Ethan Cole," Ethan said. "Passing through." "He was just leaving," William said quickly. "No," Martha said. Everyone looked at her. She was still standing in the doorway, and her voice had been quiet, not loud, not defiant, just precise. The voice of someone who had made a small decision and was going to hold it. "He wasn't leaving," she said. "He was talking to my father." Vance looked at her for a moment with the patient expression of a man who has decided that small rebellions are something to be managed rather than taken seriously. Then he looked back at Ethan. "Cole," he said. "You got business on this property." "Friendly visit," Ethan said. "You know this man, William?" William Caldwell looked between the two of them with the expression of someone watching two weather systems move toward each other and trying to calculate which way to run. "We met yesterday," William said carefully. "He came back," Martha said. That landed differently than she probably intended. Vance's eyes moved back to her slower this time. The inventory look again, but sharper. "Go inside, Martha," Vance said. She didn't move. The silence stretched. Ethan watched Vance's jaw tighten, just slightly, the way a man's does when he's encountered an outcome he didn't plan for and is deciding how much it costs him to correct it in front of a witness. "Martha," William said softer, pleading under the word. She looked at her father. Something moved through her face, that grief again, the kind that comes from loving someone who is failing you. She went inside. The screen door closed behind her. Vance turned to Ethan. "I don't know what your business is," he said, "but this family is about to be my family, which means their business is my business, which means—" He paused, letting the weight of it sit. "You're standing in the wrong yard." "Is that right?" Ethan said. Not a question. "That's right." Ethan looked at William Caldwell. The older man's eyes were on the ground. "Mr. Caldwell," Ethan said, "has the date been set?" William looked up. His voice came out low. "End of the month." "Has Martha agreed?" The question went off like a quiet charge. William flinched. Vance's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "That's a family matter," Vance said. "I'm asking her father," Ethan said. William Caldwell was quiet for 4 seconds. 5, each one visible on his face. "She'll come around," he said finally. Ethan nodded slowly. He looked at Vance once more directly without blinking. The kind of look that doesn't threaten but records, and then he turned and walked to his horse and mounted up. He didn't ride out of the gate. He stopped 20 yards down the road in the strip of shade from a lone cottonwood, and he sat there in plain view of the property and waited. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for. He was sure it would come. It took 40 minutes. Vance's wagon rolled out of the gate and turned toward town, moving fast. Ethan watched it go. Then he turned Cord back toward the ranch. William Caldwell was in the barn when Ethan found him. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had been waiting to finish a conversation he hadn't wanted to start. "You're not going to leave this alone," William said without turning around. "No, sir." Ethan said. What is it you think you can do? The old man's voice wasn't angry. It was tired. You think I haven't sat up nights trying to find another way Vance holds the note? He filed the lien legal. I've got 60 days before he can move to take the property, and I have got nothing to pay it with. You got that kind of money on you, Mr. Cole? No, Ethan said. Then what are you offering good intentions? A short, humorless sound. Martha's a good girl. She's smart. She knows how to work. Vance isn't going to, he's not going to mistreat her. Not badly. He wants a wife who manages a household, not... She told you she doesn't want this. She's 23 years old. She told you she doesn't want this, Ethan said again. William turned around. His face up close was the face of a man carrying something that had broken him quietly over a long period of time. The lines in it weren't just age. They were the map of all the nights he'd lain awake trying to make an impossible situation come out different. She told me, he said quietly. And you're doing it anyway. I'm losing my land. His voice cracked on the last word, thin like old wood. My father broke this land. I've worked it for 30 years. My hands. He looked at them briefly, then away. I cannot watch it go. I cannot. And if I lose it, Martha loses it too. She loses everything. At least with Vance, she has a house. She has security. She has a man she didn't choose, Ethan said. Holding a debt over everything she touches. William closed his eyes. Is there another way to clear the lien? Ethan said. I told you, I don't have the money. That's not what I asked. Is there another way? The old man was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in his face, reluctant, careful like a man moving a piece of furniture he doesn't want to move because he's afraid of what's underneath. There are back grazing permits, he said finally. Territorial land north of here. If I had the cattle to run on them and the capital to operate for one season, I could clear the lien by October. But I don't have the capital, and I can't get it. The bank won't lend against a property with an active lien, and there's no one in this county who... I know someone in Mesilla, Ethan said. Silence. A man named Garrett. Runs a freighting operation. He owes me a conversation at least. Ethan leaned against the stall. He's not a bank, but he's not Vance either. William Caldwell stared at him. Why, he said, would a drifting cowboy who's been on my property for a total of maybe 2 hours care what happens to my ranch? Ethan thought about that. The honest answer was the only one he had. Because your daughter sat in the dirt, he said, and didn't ask for help. And I can't stop thinking about that. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Martha was in the kitchen when Ethan came in to refill his canteen, and she didn't startle when she heard his boots on the floor, which told him she'd known he was still on the property. What did you say to him? She said without turning from the basin. Told him I might know someone who could help with the lien. She was quiet. Might, she said. Might. He confirmed. She turned around, then drying her hands on her apron, and looked at him with the direct measuring gaze that he was starting to understand was just how she looked at the world, not mistrustful exactly, more like a woman who had learned that accurate information was more valuable than comfortable assumptions. And if it doesn't work, she said, then we're where we are. And if it does work, she tilted her head slightly. Vance still has the lien. My father still agreed to terms. Harold Vance is not the kind of man who lets go of something because a drifter rides into town and finds a creative solution. No, Ethan agreed. He's not. So what then? One thing at a time, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said quiet and very precise, Mr. Cole, why are you really here? He met her eyes. I told you. You told me a reason. I'm asking for the real one. He was quiet for a beat. Then, I turned around, he said, after I left. Made it 2 miles and turned around. I don't do that. I haven't done that in a long time. I reckon that means something, and I'm following it until I know what. She considered that. Her hands were still in front of her holding the apron. Her face was completely composed, and under that composure, he could see just barely that something in his answer had reached her in a place she wasn't ready to examine. "That's not a plan," she said. "No, ma'am. It's a start." He rode to Mesilla that afternoon. He found Hector Garrett at his freighting yard, tallying invoices in the back of a wagon with the focused irritability of a man who distrusts numbers but can't stop checking them. Garrett was 60-something, built like a weathered post, with a face that looked like it had been rained on a great deal, and a personality that ran blunt in every direction. He looked up when Ethan appeared, and his expression moved from annoyance to something more complicated. "Cole," he said. "Garrett? Thought you were dead." "Not yet." Garrett climbed down from the wagon and looked at him properly. "It's been what? 5 years?" 6. "You look like the 6 years were not kind to you." "Kinder than I deserved," Ethan said. "I need to talk to you about a loan." Garrett's eyebrows rose. "You need money." "Not for me." He laid out the situation. Caldwell Ranch, the lien, the grazing permits, the timeline, what would be needed to get one season's cattle operation running well enough to produce a return by October. He kept it clean and factual, the way Garrett liked things. When he finished, Garrett was quiet for a while, turning a pencil in his hands. "What's your stake in this?" Garrett said. "None yet." "But you're planning to have one." Ethan said nothing. Garrett looked at him for a long moment. "This about the woman. It's about whether a man has the right to use a financial instrument to force a woman into a marriage she refused." "That is a very fine legal and moral position," Garrett said. "It does not answer my question. It answers the only part of your question that matters." Garrett grunted, turned the pencil, looked at the middle distance for a while with the expression of a man running numbers in his head that had nothing to do with money. "Caldwell," he said finally. "William Caldwell. I know that name from somewhere. His father drove freight for you, early 60s. Garrett's head came up. "Ben Caldwell's boy." That'd be right. Something shifted in the old freighter's face. Not sentiment exactly, Garrett was constitutionally opposed to sentiment, but something near it. The look of a man who believes in accounts, and has just discovered one he'd forgotten, was open. "Ben Caldwell drove for me for 9 years, he said. Honest as the day is long. Showed up in a blizzard once when no one else would." He paused. "Never missed a payment. Never shorted a load." "No, sir," Ethan said. "His boy's in trouble. His boy made some bad decisions and then ran out of road," Ethan said. "And now he's looking at sacrificing his daughter to pay for it." Garrett was quiet for another moment. "I'll want to see the land," he said. "When?" "Tomorrow morning." When Ethan rode back into the Caldwell yard that evening, Martha was at the well drawing water, and she looked up when she heard Cord's hooves and stood very still while Ethan dismounted. "Well," she said, "he wants to see the property tomorrow." She set down the bucket, very carefully, like she was afraid she might drop it. "That's you did that in one afternoon. Garrett's a practical man. He'll want to look at the land and the permits and the cattle count before he decides anything, but he'll come." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What does he want in return?" "Fair interest, standard terms." "Why would he do it?" "He knew your grandfather." Something crossed her face that he hadn't seen there before. It wasn't hope, she was too careful for hope. It was more like the particular expression of someone who has been bracing for a blow for so long that even the possibility of its not landing feels dangerous. "This doesn't fix everything," she said. "No, ma'am. Harold Vance won't just he'll fight it." "Probably. He has lawyers. He has relationships in this county. He has—" She paused. "He has my father's agreement, in writing." Ethan looked at her. "Does he?" Something in his tone made her look back at him sharply. "My father signed something," she said. "I don't know exactly what." "Has Vance filed it anywhere, made it legal?" I don't know. I'll need to find out." She stared at him. How? Carefully, he said. The sun had dropped behind the western ridge, and the air had finally begun to release the day's heat, slightly reluctantly, the way the desert always did, like it didn't want to give anything up. Martha pushed a loose strand of hair back from her face and looked at him with the direct measuring gaze that he'd learned meant she was deciding something. "You're going to get yourself into trouble," she said. "I've been in trouble before. Not this kind. Vance is—" She stopped. Started again. "He's not just a bully with money, Mr. Cole. He's connected. He's got the county sheriff on a first-name basis, and 2 of the 3 magistrates have eaten dinner at his table. If he decides you're a problem, he has ways of making that very expensive." "I know men like Vance," Ethan said. "I've known him my whole life," she said quietly. "I know what he's capable of." "What is he capable of?" She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was level, but there was something underneath it that he recognized, not fear exactly. Memory. 3 years ago, she said, there was a family east of here, the Pruitts. They had a water dispute with Vance over the creek boundary. It went to the county board. She paused. A month later, their barn burned. No one could prove anything. They sold and moved to Texas. Ethan was quiet. A year before that, she said, a man named Cook made a complaint to the territorial office about Vance's grazing practices on shared land. Cook's cattle started dying, one by one, all of them sick by spring. She looked at him steadily. No one could prove anything. "He's careful," Ethan said. "He's very careful," she said. "And he's patient. And he's been waiting for this." She gestured at the property, at her father's house, at everything around her, for a long time. He's not going to let a passing cowboy undo it. Ethan held her eyes. "Are you trying to scare me off?" he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then very quietly, "I'm trying to make sure you know what you're walking into." "Now I know," he said. Something changed in her face then. Not by much, she was too controlled for much. But something behind her eyes shifted like a lock that has been sitting in the same position for years and has just heard a sound that might possibly be a key. "You're a strange man, Mr. Cole," she said. "So I've been told." She picked up her water bucket, turned toward the house. At the doorway she stopped, and without turning around she said quietly to the frame of the door, "Thank you, for today." He didn't answer. He wasn't sure an answer was what the moment needed. That night, lying in his bedroll under the cottonwood, he hadn't gone back to Mesilla, had made camp just outside the fence line close enough to hear if something happened. Ethan stared up at the stars and thought carefully about Harold Vance. He'd known men like Vance. Men who moved slowly and legally and built their power through paperwork and patience, rather than through the direct application of force that could be witnessed and responded to. Those men were in some ways more dangerous than the ones who simply drew guns because there was nothing to fight directly. Everything they did had a layer of deniability over it, like grease over water, and the law slid off it without catching. But men like that also had a weakness. They depended on the machinery staying invisible. They depended on no one looking closely, no one asking the right questions, no one pulling at the threads loudly enough in a public enough place to make the whole thing unravel. Ethan was good at pulling threads. He'd learned that from a man he never talked about in a situation he never described back when he'd been a very different kind of person and had used the skill for purposes he wasn't proud of. But the skill remained. He was still thinking when he heard the footstep. He was on his feet before the sound finished, hand near his hip, and then he saw her and stopped. Martha Caldwell was standing 10 feet away, wrapped in a shawl against the cooling desert night, holding a lantern low so the light wouldn't carry far. She looked at him at the speed with which he'd risen at the hand near his hip and said nothing about either. "I found something," she said. He waited. She held out a folded paper. "The agreement. Between my father and Vance." She paused. "It was in the desk. I've seen it before, but I never read it carefully until tonight." He took the paper, held it close to the lantern, and read. It was 2 minutes of reading. careful, thorough. When he looked up, his face must have shown something because she said immediately, "What?" "This isn't legally binding," he said. She stared at him. "It's a letter of intent," he said. "It's not a contract of marriage. It's not a betrothal agreement with witnesses and proper signatures. It's—" Vance wrote this. It's weighted entirely in his language. But it doesn't have a magistrate's seal. It doesn't have a formal witness structure. In a territorial court. He paused, thinking. In a territorial court, a woman's refusal supersedes a letter of intent. There's an 1876 territorial ruling. I know it because I had reason to once. Martha was very still. "He doesn't know you know that," she said slowly. "He may not know it himself. He may have written this expecting no one would look close enough to question it. Or," she said, "he does know it, and he's planning to handle it before it ever gets to a court." "By getting the marriage done fast," Ethan said. "End of the month," she said. They looked at each other in the low lantern light, the desert quiet around them, and the stars overhead, and the situation between them like a map that had just been redrawn with new information. "If Garrett agrees to the loan," Ethan said, "the lien clears. Your father's financial obligation to Vance disappears, which removes the only leverage Vance has over your father. He'll still claim the letter. Then we contest it, publicly, in front of witnesses." He held her eyes. "But it has to be your refusal, Miss Caldwell, in front of the county, on record. He can't override a witnessed public refusal from a woman who is not a minor." She was quiet for a long moment. "You're asking me to stand up in front of this county," she said carefully, "and refuse Harold Vance, publicly." "Yes. You understand what that means for me, in this town. A fat, unmarried woman who refuses the wealthiest man in the county." Her voice was steady, completely controlled, but under the control he could hear the weight of it. "You understand what they'll say." "I do," he said. "I also think you've been hearing what they say for a long time, and it hasn't made you disappear yet." The words landed. She looked at him. Really looked at him the way she had that first morning when something behind her eyes had shifted just slightly. And this time what moved through her face wasn't just surprise. It was something that looked cautiously like recognition, like a woman seeing for the first time that someone had looked at her clearly, not past the weight, not past the dress, not past everything the world had decided she was, and seen the person underneath. She didn't say anything. She took the lantern back and turned toward the house and walked into the dark without another word. But she didn't move the way she'd moved before. There was something different in it, a degree of straightness in the spine that hadn't been quite so visible in the daylight. Ethan stood in the dark under the cottonwood and watched the lantern light move toward the house and thought, she's deciding. And whatever she decided, it would be real. Because it would be hers. He lay back down in his bedroll. He didn't sleep for a while. In the morning, Harold Vance came back, and this time, he brought the sheriff. The sheriff's name was Calhoun. Ethan knew the type before the man opened his mouth. The badge sat on his chest, like it had been there so long it had grown into the fabric, and he wore the particular expression of a man who had learned over many years that the most comfortable position in any dispute was the one closest to whoever held the money. He came through the gate behind Vance's wagon, riding a roan mare, and he didn't look at Ethan when he dismounted. He looked at the house, then at Vance, waiting for the social order to establish itself before he decided where he fit in it. Vance climbed down from the wagon and didn't hurry. He straightened his jacket, settled his hat, and then turned to survey the yard with the expression of a man returning to a property he already considers his own. "Cole," he said when he saw Ethan standing by the cottonwood. "You're still here." "I am," Ethan said. "That's trespassing. I'm outside the fence line." Vance's jaw tightened. He looked at Calhoun. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Mr. Cole, this gentleman has filed a formal complaint. Says you've been interfering in private family business. I'm going to need you to move along." "Has he?" Ethan said. "He has." "What kind of interference specifically?" Calhoun looked uncomfortable. The question was too direct for the amount of preparation he'd done this morning. He says you've been talking to members of the family, stirring things up. Talking is interference now, Ethan said. That's new. On private property. I've been on public road and on the property at the family's invitation. Ethan looked at Vance. Which member of the Caldwell family asked me to leave? The screen door opened. William Caldwell came out first, moving with the careful pace of a man who hadn't slept and knew this morning was going to cost him something. Behind him, Martha appeared in the doorway, and she stood there the way she'd stood the day before. Square, contained, watching. Calhoun looked at William. Mr. Caldwell, this man bothering you? William opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Papa, Martha said from the doorway. Her voice was quiet and even. Tell him the truth. William looked at his daughter, and in the look that passed between them, Ethan saw the whole of it, a father who loved his child and had convinced himself he was protecting her by destroying her, and a daughter who understood that and hadn't stopped loving him for it and hadn't forgiven him for it either. Both things at once. The way love actually works when it's real and complicated and has nowhere clean to land. He's not bothering me, William said finally. Mr. Cole is here at my invitation. Vance's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. William, he said, and the pleasantness in his voice had thinned to something harder underneath, like a board that started to rot. We had an agreement. We had a letter, William said. That's different. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when something irrevocable has just been said, and everyone in earshot is adjusting to the new shape of the situation. Vance took one step toward the porch. Just one. Deliberate and slow. I think, he said, you need to remember what's at stake here. The note, the assessment, the 60-day window. He paused. I'm being very patient, William, but my patience is not unlimited. Mr. Vance, Ethan said. Vance turned. The letter you have is not a legal contract of marriage. It's a letter of intent with no magistrate seal and no formal witness structure. Under the 1876 territorial ruling, a woman's documented refusal supersedes any informal agreement made on her behalf. Ethan held the man's gaze. You knew that when you wrote it. The silence this time was different, sharper, the kind of silence that comes after something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Calhoun was looking at Vance. The look wasn't exactly suspicious. The man wasn't built for suspicion where his income was concerned, but it was uncertain, which was something. Vance recovered in about 2 seconds. He was good at that. That's a very specific piece of legal knowledge for a drifting cowboy, he said. I read When the Nights Are Long, Ethan said. Where'd you practice law? Cole in a jail cell. Never practiced law. Just know enough to recognize when a document is designed to look more binding than it is. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Which raises the question of who it was designed to fool. The Caldwells, or a judge. Calhoun took a small step back. Just one. But Ethan saw it. Vance's eyes went very cold and very calm. Sheriff, he said without looking away from Ethan, I want this man off this county road. On what grounds? Ethan said. Disturbing the peace. Whose peace? Mine. That's not how disturbing the peace works, Ethan said pleasantly. And I think Sheriff Calhoun knows that. Everyone looked at Calhoun. The man had the look of someone who had walked into a room expecting a simple errand and discovered a fire. Mr. Cole, Calhoun said carefully, maybe you could just give everybody some space to talk this through. I could, Ethan said. Or Mr. Caldwell could tell us right now whether he's withdrawing from the letter of intent, which would settle a great deal. William Caldwell stood on his porch and looked at Harold Vance, and Harold Vance looked back at him with the calm, patient look of a man holding a hand he knows is better than anything across the table. William, Vance said quietly. Think carefully. Vance. Martha stepped out of the doorway onto the porch. She came to stand beside her father, and she put her hand on his arm, not gripping just there. Present. A daughter standing next to a father at the edge of the hardest decision of both their lives. "Papa," she said, "a man came to see me last night." Everyone went still. Vance's eyes moved to her. "Not Cole," she said before anyone could speak. "A man named Garrett. Hector Garrett from Mesilla." She looked at Vance directly, steadily. "He came to look at the grazing permits. He's interested in providing operating capital for 1 season. Against the permits and the cattle." She paused. "He says by October the lien could be cleared." The yard was absolutely quiet. Vance stared at her, then at Ethan, then back at her. "Garrett," he said. "He knew my grandfather," Martha said. "Ben Caldwell drove freight for him for 9 years. He said my grandfather never missed a payment. He seems to feel that means something." She delivered this information the way she delivered everything, quietly, precisely, without theater. But her hand was still on her father's arm, and Ethan could see from where he stood that her fingers had tightened slightly. She hadn't rehearsed this. She'd decided it. This morning, or last night, or sometime between the lantern going out and the sun coming up, she had decided to stop being someone to whom things happened, and to start being someone who walked toward the thing coming at her and met it head on. "Garrett won't loan money against an encumbered property," Vance said. "He seems to think the encumbrance is contestable," Martha said. "On what grounds?" She met his eyes without blinking. "He has a lawyer. He suggested we talk to her." Her. Ethan hadn't known about a lawyer. He looked at Martha and understood that she had done something between last night and this morning that he hadn't suggested and hadn't anticipated. She had moved on her own. Vance's face went through something. It was fast, and he controlled it well, but Ethan caught at a flash of something that wasn't anger and wasn't surprise exactly. It was recalculation. The rapid, cold arithmetic of a man who has just discovered the board he was playing on is larger than he thought. "I want to speak with William," Vance said. "Alone." "No," Martha said. Vance looked at her. "Whatever you say to my father," she said, "you say in front of me. I'm done with conversations that happen in rooms I'm not in." She held his gaze. "This is still my father's property, Mr. Vance. For now." The last 2 words landed like a blade laid flat on a table. A statement of awareness, not a threat. She knew the situation. She wasn't pretending otherwise. But she wasn't pretending it was already over either. Calhoun cleared his throat. "I think maybe everybody ought to cool down." "Sheriff," Ethan said, "has Vance filed anything with the county court regarding this marriage agreement?" Calhoun hesitated. Not that I've seen come across the desk." "Then there's nothing legally actionable here," Ethan said. "Which means there's nothing for you to enforce." He looked at the man directly. "Which means you're here as a favor, not as the law." Calhoun's face did something complicated. A man being seen clearly doesn't enjoy the experience, and Calhoun had spent a long time making himself useful to people like Vance precisely by not being seen clearly. "I'm going," Calhoun said. He looked at Vance. "Harold, I need more to work with than a letter. If you want it enforced, you need to file it proper." He mounted his horse. He didn't look at anyone as he rode out. Vance watched him go. Then he looked at Ethan with the expression of a man making a permanent entry in a private ledger. "You think that helped you?" he said quietly. "I think it helped Miss Caldwell," Ethan said. "You don't know this county. You don't know what I can do." "I know what you've done," Ethan said. "Pruitt family, east of here, barn fire." He paused. "Cook. Lost his whole cattle herd to sickness." He let the word sit. "I know careful when I see it, Vance. And careful means something's there to hide. It was a calculated risk. He knew it. He was showing a hand he couldn't fully back up, yet he had no proof of either thing, only Martha's account. But he needed Vance to know that the invisibility he depended on had just developed a crack, and that someone was standing at that crack, looking through it. Vance was quiet for 5 full seconds. "Garrett's loan falls through," he said finally. "And it will. I'll make sure of it. This property reverts to me by the terms of the lien, and no drifter with a memory for obscure territorial rulings is going to change that. He picked up his reins. End of the month, William. I'll expect your answer. He drove out. The yard was quiet. William Caldwell sat down heavily on the porch step like something had gone out of his legs and put his head in his hands. Martha stood beside him and looked at the gate Vance had ridden through, and her face was calm, and her jaw was set, and she looked like a woman standing at the edge of a very long drop, deciding whether to jump or find a different way down. He's going to go after Garrett, she said. Probably, Ethan said. We need to move faster than he does. She looked at him. What does that mean? It means we need to get Garrett to commit before Vance gets to him. It means we need to find out exactly how Vance's lien is structured and whether there's a procedural challenge. It means... He paused. It means I need to send a wire to a man in Santa Fe today. Who? His name is Aldous Webb. He's a territorial land attorney. Difficult man. Extraordinarily good. Ethan looked at her. He owes me a debt. Not money. The other kind. Martha was looking at him with the careful, measuring gaze. How many people owe you debts, Mr. Cole? She said. Enough, he said. And who do you owe? He was quiet for a moment. Nobody living, he said. Something moved through her eyes that she didn't address. She looked at her father. Papa, she said. I need you to stand up now. William lifted his head. I need you to be a father today, she said. Quiet. No accusation in it. Just directness, the way you'd speak to someone you need to be able to count on. Not a man trying to save his land. A father. Can you do that? William looked at his daughter for a long moment, and in his face, Ethan saw something beginning to break open. Not the land, not the money, but the story he'd been telling himself. The one where what he was doing was protecting her. Martha, I know you love me, she said. I've never doubted that. But I need you to love me out loud today, not in a way that stays in this yard. Her father looked at her. His eyes were wet. All right, he said. Ethan rode to Mesilla in 2 hours at a pace that left Cord unhappy but willing. He sent the wire to Aldous Webb in Santa Fe, brief, factual, the kind of message that says everything in the space between the lines. And then he went to Garrett's yard and found the man in his office, which was a converted tack room that smelled of old leather and coffee, and the specific tension of someone who has already been visited that morning. Vance got here first, Garrett said when Ethan walked in. Ethan stopped. What did he say? Offered me a shipping contract, 3-year exclusive on the southern freight route from El Paso. Garrett looked at him steadily. Worth considerably more than whatever interest I'd make on a ranch loan. Ethan was quiet. What'd you tell him? He said. Garrett leaned back in his chair. He had the particular stillness of a man who has already worked out where he stands and is comfortable there. I told him I'd think about it, he said. And then I thought about it for about 20 minutes. He picked up his coffee cup. Ben Caldwell drove for me in January of '64, dead of winter. I had a contract with the Union Army supplies to Fort Craig. My best driver quit 2 days before the run because the road was ice solid and the pass was dangerous. He paused. Ben showed up, said he'd heard I needed a man. He drove that road in 3 days in conditions that would have stopped a younger man. Delivered every crate. He set the cup down. Never asked for extra, never mentioned it again. Ethan waited. Vance can have his freight contract, Garrett said. I'm going to see the Caldwell property this afternoon, and if the land and permits are what you said they are, I'll make the loan. He looked at Ethan over the rim of the cup. But Cole, Vance doesn't forget. You understand that. I do, Ethan said. And the girl, the daughter. She's the one driving this more every hour, Ethan said. Garrett nodded slowly. Ben would have liked that, he said. He always said the women in that family were the spine of it. The wire from Aldous Webb came back in 4 hours. Ethan was at the telegraph office when the clerk handed it to him, and he read it twice, standing at the counter, and then he read it a third time to make sure he hadn't misunderstood. He hadn't. He rode back to the Caldwell ranch faster than he'd left it. Martha was in the yard when he arrived, talking to an older woman he didn't recognize. Heavy-set, gray-haired, wearing a no-nonsense expression, and a dress that said she didn't care what anyone thought of either. She had a leather satchel over one arm and the look of someone who had ridden out from somewhere with a purpose. "Mr. Cole," Martha said when he dismounted. "This is Clara Mendez. She's the attorney Garrett mentioned." He nodded at her. "Ma'am, Mr. Cole." Clara Mendez looked him over with quick professional eyes. "I understand you identified the procedural weakness in Vance's letter." "I flagged it," he said. "You're the lawyer. I've looked at the letter. You're right, it's not enforceable as written. But Vance will know that by now if he has anyone competent advising him, which means he'll move to formalize it before we can contest it." She looked at Martha. "Which means we need a public witnessed statement of refusal on record before he files anything with the court." "How soon?" Martha said. "Tomorrow morning, county courthouse, before he can get a magistrate to look at a formal filing." She paused. "It needs to be you, Miss Caldwell, in person, in front of a court recorder." Martha was quiet for a moment. "If I do that," she said carefully, "it becomes a public document. Every person in this county will know I refused him." "Yes," Clara said. "They'll know my father tried to sell me. They'll know your father made a private agreement under financial duress that his adult daughter has chosen to reject on legal grounds. Those are different things." Clara looked at her steadily. "What they'll really know, Miss Caldwell, is that you stood up in a county courthouse and said no." Martha stood very still. Ethan spoke then. "The wire from Webb," he said, and held the paper out to her. "Read the third paragraph." She took the paper. He watched her face as she read. The third paragraph of Aldous Webb's wire stated with characteristic economy that the lien Vance held on the Caldwell property contained a filing irregularity. The property description didn't match the survey coordinates registered at the territorial office. It was a clerical error, possibly innocent, possibly not. But it meant the lien as filed was challengeable on procedural grounds in a territorial court. It wouldn't dissolve the debt, but it would create enough legal uncertainty to delay any enforcement action for months. Maybe longer if Webb filed the right motions, which he had already offered to do, for no fee. Martha lowered the paper. "He's challenging the lien," she said. "Already drafting the motion," Ethan said. "It buys time. Enough time for Garrett's loan to go through and the debt to be cleared by the actual terms." She looked at him, then at the paper. Then she closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, Ethan could see just in the set of her face the enormous weight of the calculation she was running. Not a simple calculation, not a mathematical one, but the kind a person runs when they are trying to figure out if they are strong enough to do something that terrifies them. She opened her eyes. "What time tomorrow?" she said to Clara. 8 in the morning, Clara said, "before the regular docket." "Will there be people there?" "Some. Courthouse opens early." "I want there to be people there," Martha said. Clara looked at her carefully. "That changes the nature of it." "I know." Martha folded the wire paper and handed it back to Ethan. "I've been invisible in this county for 23 years. I've sat in this yard and been talked about and traded and discussed, and nobody once asked me what I wanted. Not in public, not where it could be heard." Her voice was steady, completely steady. "If I'm going to say no to Harold Vance, I want every person who ever looked through me to hear it." Clara Mendez looked at her for a long moment. Then something moved in the older woman's face, not surprise, something closer to recognition. The look of a woman who has done her own version of this and remembers what it cost. "All right," Clara said. "I'll make sure there are people there." That evening, Vance made his third move. It was the move Ethan had been waiting for, the one that confirmed what kind of man they were dealing with, and removed any remaining ambiguity about how far he was willing to go. One of the Caldwell Ranch hands, a young man named Jesse, who had worked there 2 years and boarded in the bunkhouse, came to the main house at dusk. His hat was in his hands, and he wouldn't quite meet anyone's eyes. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "Vance sent a man out to the bunkhouse this afternoon, while you were in town, talked to the hands." William looked at him. "And—" Jesse swallowed. "He offered triple wages to anyone who'd testify at the courthouse if it came to that they'd seen Miss Martha behave in an improper way. With the stranger." He glanced at Ethan. "With Mr. Cole." The kitchen went very quiet. Martha was at the table. She didn't move. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her, and her face was doing what it always did when something hit her, going perfectly still while she processed it somewhere private. "What did the hands say?" Ethan asked. Jesse's jaw worked. "2 of 'em left this afternoon, took their pay and went." He paused. "The rest of us told him to get off the property." William Caldwell put both hands on the counter and stood there with his head down. "He's going to try to discredit her," Ethan said to Clara, who had stayed for supper and was now sitting at the far end of the table with her hands around a coffee cup. "Of course he is," Clara said. "If the letter is challenged and the lien is challenged and the refusal is public, his only remaining option is to damage her reputation badly enough that her testimony is questioned." She looked at Martha. "Is there anything he could use?" "No," Martha said flatly. "Nothing anyone could interpret." "No," Martha said again, same tone. "I'm 23 years old, and I've spent every day of those 23 years on this ranch or in this town, and I have never given anyone a single thing to use against me. Because I always knew something like this was possible. A woman who looks like me doesn't get to make mistakes." Her voice didn't waver. "So I didn't make any." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said simply. "The 2 hands who left," Martha said, "will they testify for him?" "If he's paying triple wages, possibly," Clara said. "But it doesn't matter if the statement goes on record tomorrow before he files anything. A public witnessed refusal filed before any counterclaim is substantially harder to challenge." "Then tomorrow matters more than tonight," Ethan said. "Tonight matters too," Martha said. She looked at her father. "Papa, Vance went to the bunkhouse. To our people. That's he crossed something tonight." William raised his head. His face had changed over the course of this day, not dramatically, but something in it had settled like a man who has been arguing with himself for a long time and has finally landed on a side. "He crossed a great many things," William said. "I need to know that tomorrow you stand beside me," Martha said. "Not behind me, not in the house, beside me." Her father looked at his daughter, at the woman she was the woman he'd helped make, and then tried to trade away because he'd run out of other options, and who had somehow in the space of 2 days become the one holding the situation together. "I'll be beside you," he said. She nodded. Once. She looked at Ethan last. "And you," she said. "Where do you want me?" he said. She thought about that for a moment, and he could see her deciding something, weighing it, measuring it against something internal. "Not in front," she said. "This has to be mine, but—" She paused. "Close." "Close," he said. At 9 that night, Ethan walked the fence line of the property the way he always walked the perimeter of a place when something felt like it was building toward something. The desert was cool now and quiet, and above him the stars were so thick and close that in certain moods they felt like company. He thought about tomorrow. He thought about Clara's strategy, and Webb's motion, and Garrett's loan, and the specific, precise sequence of things that needed to happen in the right order for this to come out on the right side of the ledger. He thought about the 2 hands who had taken Vance's money. And then he stopped walking, because at the far edge of the north fence line, where the Caldwell property met the road leading east toward Vance's ranch, a lantern was moving in the dark, not toward the house, along the fence, slow and deliberate. He stood very still and watched. The lantern stopped. Then it moved again, and he heard the soft clink of metal. Someone touching the fence. The latch of the north gate. He moved toward it without a sound. He got close enough to see, before the man saw him, a ranch hand he didn't recognize, broad through the shoulder, doing something to the gatepost. Not breaking in, something more deliberate, something involving a piece of paper and a nail. "That's far enough," Ethan said. The man spun. The lantern swung. In the lantern light, Ethan could see what the man had been nailing to the post a notice. Printed, not handwritten. Official looking. The kind of thing that found in the morning by the Caldwells before they could get to town might look like a legitimate legal document and create enough doubt and fear to make Martha pull back from the courthouse. He stepped forward and took the notice off the nail before the man could react. He read it. It was a formal-looking eviction notice. But the seal was wrong. The date was wrong. And the signature at the bottom was a poor imitation of a county clerk's signature he happened to have seen once on a real document. It was a forgery. The man saw Ethan's face and made a calculation and ran. Ethan let him go. He had what he needed. He stood at the north gate in the dark with the forged eviction notice in his hand and looked at it for a long time. Vance had done this before sundown. Had it printed, which meant he had someone in town who could produce official-looking documents on demand, which was a different category of operation than a bully with money and connections. This was someone who had done this before. This was someone who had built an infrastructure of intimidation and document fraud and witness bribery that had operated invisibly in this county for years, possibly longer, and had never been looked at directly because no one had ever been standing at the fence in the dark when the lantern came down the road. Ethan looked at the forged document in his hand. He thought, this is not just about Martha Caldwell and her father's ranch. He thought, this is what Vance is. And tomorrow morning, at 8 o'clock, in front of as many witnesses as Clara Mendez could arrange, it was all going to come into the light. He walked back to the house and knocked on Clara's door. She answered it immediately, which told him she hadn't been sleeping either. He handed her the document. She looked at it for 15 seconds. When she looked up, her face was the face of a lawyer who has just been handed everything she needed and is already thinking about how to use it. "He forged a county seal," she said. "He had it printed," Ethan said, "which means he has a printer, which means this isn't the first time." Clara looked at the document again. "This doesn't just help Martha," she said slowly. "This is enough to open a formal investigation into everything. The Pruitts, the Cooks, all of it." "Yes," Ethan said. She was quiet. "Tomorrow changes," she said. "It's not just a refusal now." "No," Ethan said. "Martha needs to know." "I know." They looked at each other in the doorway, and in the look was the shared weight of what the morning was going to require from a 23-year-old woman who had been sitting in the dirt 2 days ago and who tomorrow was going to walk into a county courthouse and bring down something that had been standing for a very long time. "Is she ready?" Clara said. Ethan thought about Martha's hands flat on the table, her voice steady, saying, "I want there to be people there." Her face in the lantern light the night before when she'd started to walk differently. "I think," he said, "she's been ready for a long time. She just didn't have anywhere to go with it." Clara nodded. She closed her door. Ethan went back to his bedroll under the cottonwood. In 4 hours, it would be morning. The morning came in hard and bright, the way summer mornings did in New Mexico. No gradual warming, no gentle suggestion of dawn, just darkness, and then sudden total light, like the land didn't believe in transitions. Ethan was up before it arrived. He'd slept maybe 2 hours. Not from anxiety he'd learned over many years to rest, even when situations were unresolved, because a tired man made worse decisions than a calm one. But sometime before 4, he'd stopped sleeping and started thinking which were different activities that sometimes happened in the same position, and by the time the sky began to lighten, he was already at the water trough washing his face and thinking through the sequence of the morning with the methodical focus of someone laying out tools before a job. The forged eviction notice was folded in his inside pocket. He'd thought about that document for most of the 2 hours he hadn't been sleeping. About what it meant, and what it could do, and how best to use it. Clara would know the legal architecture of it better than he did. But there was a non-legal dimension to it as well, a dimension that had to do with how people understood things, how a room full of ordinary citizens processed information when it was placed in front of them in the right order. Vance had built his power on invisibility. Today, the invisible was going to become very visible, and the order in which that happened would determine everything. He heard the screen door open and turned. Martha came across the yard with 2 cups of coffee, the same way she had the first morning, direct, unhurried, giving nothing away in her walk. She was dressed more carefully than he'd seen her. The same plain, practical style, but pressed. Her hair was pinned up with the deliberate neatness of someone who understood that appearance was a kind of argument and had decided to make that argument clearly today. She handed him a cup without preamble. "You didn't sleep," she said. "Some," he said. She looked at him in the early light with the measuring gaze he'd come to understand as simply how she engaged with the world, not suspicious, just accurate. "I found the notice this morning," she said. "The forged one. You left it on the kitchen table. I thought you should see it before we got to town." "I did see it." She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "I've been thinking about it since 5 o'clock. She paused. "He had it printed. That means he planned this. Not just for us, he had this capability already, ready to use." "Yes," Ethan said. "The Pruitts," she said quietly. "The Cooks. He probably did something like this to them too. Documents that looked official. Made them feel the law was against them before they could find out it wasn't." "That's what I think," Ethan said. She was quiet for a moment. "People in this county lost things because of him. Real things. Their land, their livelihoods." She looked at him directly. "This isn't just my fight anymore." "No," he said. "It isn't." "Does Clara know how to use it?" "She does." Martha nodded once. She drank her coffee. Then she said very quietly, as if she was telling him something she'd decided overnight, and was only now saying out loud for the first time. "I used to believe that if I just stayed quiet enough and worked hard enough and didn't take up too much space eventually, the world would leave me alone. Let me exist without costing me something." She paused. "I spent a long time making myself as small as I could. Which is..." She looked down at herself briefly, with a kind of rueful clarity, "somewhat harder for me than for some people." Ethan said nothing. "It never worked," she said. "I was still too much for some people, and not enough for others, and Harold Vance wanted to own me anyway. So the smallness didn't protect me. It just made me easier to overlook." She looked up. "I'm done being overlooked." She said it the way she said most things, quietly, without performance. But it landed with the weight of something that had been decided at a very deep level, and was not subject to renegotiation. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, and finished her coffee. They rode to Mesilla in a group that Ethan hadn't entirely expected. William Caldwell drove the wagon sitting straight-backed on the seat in a way he hadn't been sitting for the past 2 days, like something had returned to his spine overnight. Clara Mendez rode beside him on a sorrel mare. Jesse, the ranch hand who'd come to the house with the news about Vance's bribery, rode behind with 2 other hands who'd stayed loyal. Martha sat in the wagon beside her father. Ethan rode Cord at a loose distance, not leading, not following. Present. The county courthouse in Mesilla was a 2-story adobe building on the main plaza that managed to look simultaneously authoritative and exhausted the way public buildings did in territorial towns. By the time their wagon pulled into the plaza, Clara had been correct. There were people. Not a crowd, but enough. The general store was open, the barber, the feed merchant across the square. A handful of people who had things to do this morning and were doing them, and who would see what happened and remember it. And Harold Vance. He was already there. He was standing on the courthouse steps with a man beside him that Ethan didn't recognize, younger, carrying a leather case, with the look of someone who had ridden from somewhere larger and considered himself to be the most educated person in most rooms he entered. A lawyer, clearly. One Vance had summoned. Vance's eyes moved to the wagon when it came into the plaza, and they stayed there calm and calculating, working through the composition of the group: William, Clara, the hands Martha, and Ethan, last with the systematic assessment of a chess player counting pieces. Then they settled on Martha. She looked back at him. Neither of them looked away first. It lasted maybe 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds, something passed between them that had nothing to do with money or land or legal documents. It was the fundamental question of the whole situation, stated without words, whether she was going to be what he had decided she was, or whether she was going to be something else entirely. She turned to her father and said, "Help me down, please." He did. Climbed down first and offered his hand, and she took it, and stepped down from the wagon, and then she smoothed her dress and looked up at the courthouse steps. Vance's lawyer came down the steps first. "Miss Caldwell," he said with the practiced courtesy of a man who deploys courtesy the way others deploy weapons. "I'm afraid there may be some confusion about this morning's proceedings. My client has a properly executed—" "There's no confusion," Clara said, stepping forward. She had the leather satchel over her arm and the expression of someone who has been doing this for 30 years and has run out of patience for procedural theater. "We're here to file a statement of refusal by an adult woman regarding an informal letter of intent that has no legal standing as a betrothal agreement. The court recorder opens at 8. It is 8. She looked past the lawyer at Vance on the steps. "Good morning, Harold." Vance looked at Clara Mendez with the look of a man recalculating something. "Clara," he said, "I didn't know you were involved in this." "I am now," she said. "The recorder isn't available this morning," the young lawyer said. "There was a scheduling." "The recorder opened the building 20 minutes ago," said a voice from the doorway. A small gray man with ink-stained fingers leaned against the doorframe. "I'm available. Good morning, Mrs. Mendez." "Good morning, Mr. Tate." The young lawyer turned to look at the recorder and then back at Clara with the expression of a man whose opening move has just been removed from the board. Vance came down the steps. He stopped in front of Martha. Up close in the morning light in the middle of the public plaza, he was still a large and powerful man. But something was different about how he looked today, Ethan thought. Or maybe it was how Martha looked. Because she was standing on level ground, looking directly at him, and she was not sitting in the dirt, and she was not looking at nothing, and whatever she had decided between 5 o'clock this morning and right now was visible in every line of her posture. "Martha," Vance said, and his voice was very gentle, which was the most dangerous it had ever sounded. "You don't have to do this. Your father and I can—" "My father isn't making this decision," she said. "I am." "You're upset." "I'm not upset," she said. "I'm clear." She held his eyes. "There's a difference. If you walk into that courthouse," he said, still gentle, still patient, "you're making an enemy of me. You understand that?" "I understand that you showed your hands last night," she said, "when you sent a man to nail a forged county document to my father's fence post." The plaza went very quiet. Vance's face didn't change. He was too controlled for that. But something behind his eyes shifted a tiny recalibration, the movement of a man deciding how to respond to information he didn't know had been gathered. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. Ethan reached into his jacket and produced the forged notice. He held it up. Not threateningly, not dramatically, just visibly in the morning light where anyone who happened to be standing in the plaza could see that there was a document being produced. And there were people standing in the plaza. The feed merchant had stopped what he was doing. The barber was in his doorway. 3 women on their way to the general store had slowed. Jesse and the other hands were watching. The court recorder, Mr. Tate, was watching from the door. "This was nailed to the north gate post at approximately 9 o'clock last night," Ethan said at a volume that carried without being loud. "It's printed to look like an official county eviction notice. The seal is incorrect. The date references a court proceeding that doesn't exist, and the signature is a forgery of the county clerk's name." He paused. "I found the man who nailed it before he finished. He ran. I have a description." Vance's lawyer put a hand on his client's arm. Vance moved his arm away without looking at the man. "That's a serious accusation," Vance said. "It's a factual account," Ethan said. "Mrs. Mendez has the document. Mr. Tate can examine the seal against the official county seal in his office right now if he'd like to." He looked at the recorder. Mr. Tate. Tate had come fully out of the doorway now. He looked at the notice Ethan was holding, then at Vance. He was a small man and a careful one, but he had the look in this moment of a man discovering that his caution has been protecting the wrong thing. "I can do that," Tate said. "This is completely," Vance's lawyer started. "Let him look," Clara said sharply. "Unless you have a reason he shouldn't." The lawyer closed his mouth. Ethan walked to the courthouse steps and handed the document to Tate. Tate took it inside. The plaza waited. Vance stood very still in the middle of it, and Ethan watched him work through his options the way a man does when the geometry of a situation has shifted against him. Not panicking, not yet, but moving through contingencies, the way water moves through cracks, looking for the one that still goes somewhere useful. He found one. "William," he said, turning to Martha's father. "Whatever this is, whatever this man has told you, the debt is real. The note is real. You owe me that money. That doesn't change." His voice was very level. "I'm a patient man, but I need an answer." William Caldwell looked at Harold Vance, and Ethan saw in his face the final dissolution of something, the last version of the story William had been telling himself about Vance being a solution rather than a predator. "You sent a man to bribe my workers," William said. His voice was quiet, not angry, something past anger. "You had a forged document printed to scare my daughter into giving up. You did that." He paused. "Whatever you did to the Pruitts, whatever you did to Cook, you did all of it." He stepped forward one step. "You are not patient, you are not a neighbor, and you are not getting my daughter." The plaza was absolutely silent. Somewhere across the square, a door opened and closed. Vance looked at William Caldwell for a long moment. Then he turned his eyes to Martha, and in them, for just a fraction of a second, Ethan saw the thing underneath all the patience and the planning. The raw, ugly fact of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted, and was encountering the experience of not getting it, and did not know what to do with that experience. "You'll regret this," he said, very quietly. "I don't think so," Martha said. Tate came back out of the courthouse. He had the forged document in one hand, and the county seal embosser in the other, the official one, brass and solid, the mark of the actual government of this county. "The seals don't match," he said to no one in particular and everyone in general. "The font on the printed document is also different from any county printing press I'm aware of." He looked at Vance's lawyer. "This is going to need to be reported." The young lawyer had the look of a man who had gotten on a train that had turned out to be going somewhere he didn't want to go. "My client has nothing to do with—" "Nobody said your client did anything," Clara said pleasantly. "But since the document was found on Caldwell property on the same evening Mr. Vance made several visits to the area, I imagine the sheriff will want to ask some questions." She paused. "The actual sheriff. From the territorial office, not Calhoun." Vance's eyes moved to her. "I have already sent a wire to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe," Clara said. "This morning, before we left." Another silence. A different quality. The kind that happens when the architecture of a situation shifts at a load-bearing point. Vance looked at Ethan. "You," he said. Just the one word. "Me," Ethan said. "Who are you?" Vance said. Not a threat. A real question. The first real question he'd asked, and it came out with the kind of weight that meant he was asking something larger than a name. "Nobody particular," Ethan said. "Just a man who heard something and stopped." Vance looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Martha. Then he looked at the document in Tate's hands and at Tate's face, and at the people standing in the plaza who had all stopped what they were doing to watch. He picked up his hat from where he'd been holding it at his side, and he put it back on his head, and he did it with the careful deliberateness of a man who is performing composure because the alternative is losing it in public, and he was too controlled to lose it in public. "We'll see how this plays out," he said. He walked to his horse. His lawyer followed quickly. They rode out of the plaza. The sound of the hooves faded. Martha let out one breath. It was the only indication she gave that she had been holding anything at all. Then she looked at Clara. "We still file," she said. "We still file," Clara agreed. Inside the courthouse in the recorder's office with William Caldwell and Jesse standing as witnesses, and Mr. Tate at his desk with his pen and his ledger, Martha Caldwell gave her formal statement of refusal. It wasn't long. Clara had prepared the language, and Martha had read it twice on the ride in, and made one change which Clara had accepted without argument. The change was in the final line. Clara's version had said, "I hereby refuse any agreement made on my behalf without my knowledge or consent." Martha's version said, "I refuse. My name is Martha Caldwell, and I refuse." She read it in a level voice looking at the document, and then she signed it, and Tate recorded it, and William signed as witness, and Jesse signed as witness, and it was done. It was in the ledger. It was real. Martha set the pen down and stood up straight, and Ethan, standing in the doorway of the recorder's office, watched her face in the moment. After it was done, the moment when the thing you have gathered yourself to do is finally behind you, and you are standing in the aftermath of your own courage. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just stood there for a moment with her hand still on the desk, and her face had the expression of someone arriving somewhere they'd been trying to get to for a very long time, and discovering that the ground was solid underfoot. Then William put his arms around her. She let him. Her hands came up and gripped the back of his jacket, and they stood like that in the recorder's office, father and daughter on the other side of something. And whatever was in that embraced the grief and the love and the failure and the trying again. It was private, and Ethan looked away from it and out the window to the plaza. The territorial marshal's office responded to Clara's wire by late afternoon. 2 deputies arrived from Santa Fe before sundown riding hard, and they went directly to the courthouse and spent 2 hours with Tate and the forged document and the county records. They asked for names and descriptions. They asked about the Pruitt fire. They asked about the Cook cattle. Ethan gave his description of the man at the gate. Jesse gave his account of the bribery conversation in the bunkhouse. Clara gave them everything in the neat, organized form of a woman who had anticipated this moment and prepared for it. By the time the deputies left to find Harold Vance, the sun had gone down. The plaza was quiet. Most of the witnesses who had been there that morning had gone home to supper. But they had not gone home to silence the story, was already moving through Mesilla, the way stories do in small places, finding every ear available. Ethan sat on the courthouse steps in the cooling evening and thought about the shape of things. Garrett had ridden out to the Caldwell Ranch that afternoon while they were at the courthouse and done his assessment. He'd sent a message by Ryder. The land was sound. The permits were solid. The cattle count was workable. He would make the loan. Terms to be signed within the week. Webb's motion challenging the lien had been filed in Santa Fe that morning. It would create a delay of months. With Garrett's loan proceeding, the actual debt could be cleared well within that window. Vance had been found at his ranch by the deputies. He had not been arrested. There wasn't enough for that yet. But he had been informed that a formal investigation into the document forgery had been opened, and that the territorial marshal was interested in speaking with him about several other matters. His lawyer had been present and had said very little. It was not finished. Ethan knew that. A man like Vance didn't become finished in a single day. There would be more moves, more counter-moves, more of the slow grinding work of dismantling something that had been built carefully over many years. But the architecture of it had changed today. The invisible had become visible. He heard boots on the steps behind him and turned. Martha sat down beside him, not close, but present. She had a shawl over her shoulders against the evening chill, and she looked out at the plaza with the expression of someone taking stock. "Garrett's in," he said. "I heard." She paused. The deputies found Vance. At his ranch. They're investigating. She nodded. Is it over? No, he said. But it's different. She was quiet for a while. Then, the Pruitts, the Cooks. If the investigation finds what I think it'll find, it might give them something to take back to court, he said. Can't promise, but it might. She looked at her hands in her lap. People lost things because nobody looked closely enough and long enough. Yes, he said. You looked, she said. You made it possible to look, he said. You kept records in here. He touched his own temple briefly, even when you had no reason to think they'd ever matter. That's what gave us something to work with. She turned to look at him. Why did you come back? She said. The real reason, not what you told me before. He looked out at the plaza. A lantern had come on above the general store door, and its light fell yellow and warm on the dust of the square. When I was a younger man, he said, I did things I'm not proud of. Used what I knew to help people who didn't deserve to be helped. Looked the other way when looking away was convenient. He paused. I've been riding away from that man for 7 years, trying to become someone worth being. He was quiet for a moment. I think sometimes you only know if you've managed it when something puts you to the test. She was watching him. You were sitting in the dirt, he said, and you didn't ask for help, and I almost kept riding. And then I thought if I ride away from this, I'm not done yet. I haven't made it all the way to the man I'm trying to be. He looked at her. So I came back. She held his gaze for a moment. And, she said, quiet. And here we are, he said. She looked back at the plaza. Something in her face had softened not into weakness, into something more like peace. The particular peace of a person who has been braced so long for the blow that when it doesn't come, the unbracing itself is a kind of rest. I don't know what to do with you, Mr. Cole, she said. You don't have to do anything with me, he said. I'm not a problem that needs solving. She almost smiled, just at the edge of it. You're a very strange man, she said for the second time. You've said that, he said. It remains true. She stood pulling the shawl tighter. My father wants to know if you'll stay for supper. You want me to? She looked at him for a moment, and in her eyes in the lantern light from across the plaza, he could see everything she wasn't yet saying, the caution and the recognition, and the thing underneath both that hadn't decided yet what it was going to call itself. Yes, she said simply. He stood. They walked back toward the wagon together, not close, not touching, but side by side, which was its own kind of answer to a question neither of them had asked yet. Behind them, through the open courthouse door, the recorder's ledger lay open on the desk, and in it, in clear ink, in the careful notation of public record Martha Caldwell, refusal recorded, witnessed and affirmed. The words were there, in the ledger, real and permanent. And somewhere in Mesilla that evening, in every house where the story had reached people, were sitting with it, turning it over, thinking about what it meant that a woman had walked into a courthouse and said no, and the courthouse had written it down. William Caldwell pulled the wagon around as they came into the plaza, and he looked at his daughter coming across the square beside Ethan Cole, and something in his face, the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying the wrong things for the wrong reasons, began slowly to let go. Harold Vance at his ranch east of town sat in his study and looked at the wall and thought about the morning and about the woman in the plaza and about the drifter who had stopped his horse on a summer road and decided not to keep riding. He was patient. But patience only worked when the situation was stable. The situation was no longer stable. He looked at his lawyer across the desk. "Find me the printer," he said. The lawyer shifted. "Harold, find me the printer," he said again, "and find out everything there is to know about Ethan Cole." The printer's name was Delbert Oakes, and he had been in Mesilla for 11 years. He ran a small print shop on the south side of the plaza, the kind of operation that produced handbills and land notices and the occasional 2-page newspaper that nobody much read, but everybody used to line their shelves. He was a quiet man, unremarkable, The kind of man a town forgets is there until they need something printed. Ethan found this out at breakfast. He was at the boarding house in Mesilla when Jesse came in from the street with the particular look of someone who has been listening in the right places and come away with something worth carrying. "Printer on the south side," Jesse said, sitting down across from Ethan and dropping his voice. "Name's Oakes. Word is Vance's man was there 2 days ago. Someone in the building next door heard the press running late at night. Didn't think anything of it at the time." Ethan set down his coffee cup. "Who told you this?" he said. "Barber," Jesse said. "Barber hears everything. Always has." Ethan thought for a moment. "Does Clara know?" "I'm going to her next." "Go now," Ethan said. "Before Vance gets to Oakes first." Jesse was out the door before the sentence finished. Ethan paid for breakfast, put on his hat, and walked out into the morning. The situation had shifted overnight in ways he'd been calculating since before dawn. Vance was not a man who accepted outcomes. He was a man who redirected who. When one path closed, immediately began locating another, and who had the resources and the patience to pursue several simultaneously. The investigation from Santa Fe was real, but investigations took time, and time was exactly what Vance had always used as a weapon. The deputies would gather information. They would file reports. Things would move through the territorial system with the grinding pace of institutional machinery. Vance knew that machinery. He'd been navigating it for years. What he hadn't navigated before was a situation where the people on the other side of him were moving faster than he was. Ethan intended to keep moving faster. Clara Mendez was already at the print shop when Ethan arrived. She had gotten there before him, which didn't surprise him, and she had Delbert Oakes sitting in a chair in his own shop, with the expression of a man who has recently understood that a decision he made for money has turned out to cost considerably more than money. Oakes was 50, soft-handed, with the careful, apologetic manner of someone who had spent his life avoiding conflict and had discovered too late that avoidance is its own kind of choice. "He paid me," Oakes was saying when Ethan came through the door. I didn't know what it was for. He said it was a property notice. He gave me the language, and I printed it. I print what people bring me." "You printed a county seal that wasn't the county seal," Clara said, with the flat precision of someone who is not interested in mitigating narratives right now. Oakes's hands twisted in his lap. "He said it was a draft, a template. He said—" "Mr. Oakes," Ethan said from the doorway. The man looked up. "The territorial deputies are in town," Ethan said. "They'll be coming to see you. That's already decided." He walked in and sat on the edge of the counter unhurried. "What's not decided yet is whether you come out of this as a man who was used by Harold Vance and cooperated fully with the investigation, or as a man who protected him." He paused. "One of those is survivable. The other one isn't." Oakes looked at him, then at Clara, then at his hands. "He told me nobody would ever know," Oakes said. "They always say that," Clara said. "How many times?" Ethan said. Oakes looked up sharply. "How many documents did you print for Vance?" Ethan said. "Not just this one." The silence that followed was long enough to tell the whole story. 3 years, Oakes said finally, very quietly. Not always like this. Mostly notices. Things that looked official. Things designed to make people think, to make them think the law was against them when it wasn't. He swallowed. "Pruitt's got one. Family named Hargrove, East County. They got one 2 years ago. They left in the spring." Clara was writing. "Hargrove," she said. "I didn't know about the Hargroves." "Nobody did," Oakes said. "That was the point." Ethan looked at Clara. She looked back at him, and in her face he could see the same arithmetic he was doing the scope of it, expanding outward from the Caldwells, to the Pruitts, to the Cooks, to the Hargroves, and possibly further a pattern of quiet document-assisted dispossession that had been operating in this county for 3 years, without anyone ever seeing the whole of it at once. Until now. "Write it down," Clara said to Oakes. "All of it. Every document, every name, every date you remember. Today." She closed her notebook. I'll send the deputies to you at noon." She walked out. Ethan followed. On the street, Clara stopped and turned to him, and her face had the focused, almost fierce expression of a lawyer who has just watched a case become significantly larger than it started. "This is not a personal grievance anymore," she said. "No," Ethan said. "This is a pattern of organized fraud against multiple property owners. The Territorial Attorney General will be interested." She paused. "Very interested." "How long does it take?" Ethan said. "Months? Possibly a year?" She looked at him steadily. "Vance will not be arrested today. I want to be clear about that. He'll have lawyers and continuances and every procedural delay available to a wealthy man. But," she paused, "his ability to operate in this county is finished. The moment this becomes a matter of territorial record, no magistrate, no county official, no bank will touch anything connected to him without examining it carefully first. The infrastructure he built is gone. That's not nothing." "It's not nothing," Ethan agreed. "It won't give the Pruitts their barn back," she said. The words were flat, not sentimental, just true. "No," he said. "It won't." They stood with that for a moment. "The Caldwells will be all right," Clara said then. "Garrett's loan is solid. Webb's challenge to the lien gives them time. By October, if the season goes reasonably, they clear the debt entirely." She put her notebook in her satchel. "Martha will be all right." Ethan nodded. Clara looked at him for a moment, with the particular look of a woman who has seen a great many situations, and has learned to read the ones that people aren't talking about. "And you," she said. He looked at her. "What do you do now, Mr. Cole?" she said. "You came through passing. You found something worth stopping for. It's not finished, but the piece that needed doing right now, it's done." She tilted her head slightly. "So what do you do?" He didn't answer that, not because he didn't have thoughts about it, but because the thoughts weren't settled yet, and he didn't believe in speaking unsettled things out loud. Clara seemed to understand that. She nodded once, as if he'd confirmed something she'd already suspected, and walked back toward the courthouse. He rode back to the Caldwell ranch at mid-morning. Martha was in the yard working. Not sitting. Not waiting. Working, going through a set of ledger books spread on the porch table with the focused, methodical attention of someone who has decided that the next practical step is understanding exactly where things stand so she can begin making them better. She looked up when she heard Cord, and something in her face settled a brief, involuntary thing like a breath released when she saw it was him. "Oakes is talking," Ethan said, dismounting. She set her pen down. "How much?" "3 years' worth. The Pruitts, the Cooks, a family named Hargrove you might not have known about. Clara's with the deputies now." Martha absorbed this with the stillness she brought to large information. Her hands were flat on the open ledger, and she looked at them for a moment. "Hargrove," she said. "Daniel and Ruth Hargrove. They had a place 12 miles east, left in the spring of last year. Ruth told me at church they were moving to be closer to family. She seemed—" Martha paused. She seemed ashamed, like she'd failed. She looked up. She hadn't failed. He took it from her. "Yes," Ethan said. "Will she know that eventually? If the investigation goes the way Clara thinks it will, yes. It'll be on record. Public." Martha nodded slowly. "Good," she said, and then quieter. "Good." She looked back at the ledger books. "I've been going through the ranch accounts, all of them. Papa had some organizational approaches that were not serving him well." The phrasing was careful and precise, and faintly quietly dry, and Ethan recognized it as the closest thing to humor he'd heard from her. "I think I can find us roughly $40 of operating efficiency by the end of the season without changing anything major. And if we restructure the grazing rotation, you know, ranching," he said. "I've lived here my whole life," she said. "I watched my father run this place. I know every acre, every head, every water source, every problem this land has, and what it needs." She looked up. "I just wasn't asked." He sat down on the porch step and looked out at the yard, and she went back to her ledger, and for a while, neither of them spoke, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that exists between people who have been through something together and don't need to fill every moment with words. "Your father around," Ethan said eventually. "In the barn," she said. "He's been in there since sunrise. I think he's—" She paused. "I think he's trying to figure out who he is now that the decision he made isn't the decision anymore." She looked at the ledger. "It's going to take him a while." "It usually does," Ethan said. She glanced at him. "Speaking from experience." "Some," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and he could see her deciding whether to say the thing she was thinking the way she sometimes did, that brief internal calculation before she spoke, weighing the cost of honesty against the cost of silence, and consistently coming down on the side of honesty. "How long are you staying?" she said. There it was. He'd known the question was coming. Had been carrying it since Clara asked him the same thing an hour ago, though Clara had asked it differently. "I don't know," he said. "Honest answer." "I prefer honest answers," she said. "I know you do." She looked down at the ledger again. Her pen moved, scratching numbers. Then she said without looking up, "There's work here, if you wanted it. My father can't run the ranch and manage the Garrett loan terms and deal with whatever comes from the investigation simultaneously. He needs help." She kept her eyes on the page. "I need help. Someone who knows land and cattle and—" She paused. "And how to read a situation before it goes wrong." "That sounds like a job offer," he said. "It is a job offer," she said. "It's not anything else. I want to be clear about that." "All right," he said. She looked up then. "All right, you understand that it's not anything else, or all right, you'll take the job." "Both," he said. Something moved through her face, not quite relief, not quite pleasure. Something more restrained than either, but warmer than anything she'd shown him yet. "Good," she said. She looked back at her ledger. "Room and board and fair wages. I'll want you to go over the grazing permit terms with Garrett when he comes to sign. And there's a fence line on the north property that needs rebuilding before fall." She turned a page. "And I'd like you to teach me to read a lien document properly, so that next time I already know." "Next time," he said. "There's always a next time," she said. "For something." Harold Vance came to the ranch that afternoon. He came alone, which was new, and he came without his lawyer, which was newer. And when Ethan saw the wagon coming up the drive, he walked to the middle of the yard and stood there and waited. Martha came out of the house. She stood on the porch. William came out of the barn. He stood at the barn door. Vance pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down and stood in the yard, and he looked different today. Not smaller, not broken, but something in the architecture of his face had changed. The patience was still there, but it was sitting differently, like a mask that had been adjusted after the face underneath shifted. He looked at Ethan first, then at Martha. "I know what Oak said," he said. Nobody responded. "I know what's coming," he said. "I'm not a fool." He paused. "I came to tell you the lien. I'm withdrawing the enforcement action. You'll get a letter from my lawyer tomorrow." The yard was completely quiet. Martha's eyes were on him. "Why?" she said. It was exactly the right question, asked exactly the way it needed to be asked, direct, without relief, without gratitude. Just why? Because the reason mattered. Because she was a woman who understood that things done for the wrong reason have a way of coming undone. Because continuing it doesn't benefit me, he said. And because he stopped, looked at the ground briefly, then back up. Because Oakes told me something this morning before the deputies got to him that I've been sitting with. "What did he tell you?" Martha said. "He told me Ruth Hargrove cried when she left," Vance said. "He could hear her through the wall when her husband came to settle the last account. He said she was talking to her husband about her garden. She'd had a rose garden on that property for 12 years. He paused. That's what she was crying about. Her roses. The silence was absolute. In all the time Ethan had spent trying to understand Harold Vance, He had not once imagined this. The patient cold calculus of the man had seemed total. He'd looked for cracks and hadn't found any. But here in the afternoon heat in the yard of a ranch he'd tried to take was something that looked like a crack. "I'm not asking for anything," Vance said. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know what I've done." He looked at Martha. "I know what I tried to do to you." He put his hat back on. "I'm withdrawing the lien enforcement. The rest is for the territory to sort out." He picked up his reins. "For what it's worth, Miss Caldwell, you're the first person who ever looked at me in a courtroom plaza and didn't flinch." That, he stopped himself. That was something. He drove out. Nobody moved for a long moment. William Caldwell sat down in the barn doorway and put his face in his hands. And this time it wasn't grief, it was something past grief, the feeling a man has when the worst thing he was afraid of doesn't happen, and the relief is so large he doesn't know what to do with it. Martha stood on the porch and watched the wagon go, and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said very quietly, to nobody in particular, and to everyone present, "Ruth Hargrove's roses." She said it like a prayer, like a reckoning, like the name of something that had been lost and was now at least acknowledged. Ethan stood in the yard and looked at the gate and thought about the way things unravel. Not always with confrontation and force, but sometimes with a single detail. A woman crying about her garden. A detail small enough to slip through the armor of a man who had told himself he was only doing business. It didn't fix the Hargroves. It didn't fix the Pruitts or the Cooks. It didn't give anyone back what Vance had taken. But it was something. And sometimes something was where repair began. 3 months passed. The summer broke in September slowly, the heat releasing its grip 1 degree at a time until the mornings had a different quality. Cooler, cleaner, the kind of air that made you feel like thinking clearly was possible again. The Garrett loan was signed in August. The grazing permits were filed, and the cattle were moved to the Northern Territorial land on schedule, and Ethan spent 6 weeks on the range managing the operation with 2 of the Caldwell hands and a hired drover who knew the North Country. It was hard, straightforward work, and he was good at it, and he came back to the ranch at the end of it, lean and sunburned and quieter than he'd left. Martha was running the books by then. Not assisting with the books, running them. William had handed them over in the 2nd week of August with the slightly dazed expression of a man discovering that the person he'd been underestimating had actually been the most capable person in the room all along. She'd reorganized the accounts, renegotiated the feed supply contract with a merchant in Las Cruces, who had been overcharging for 3 years, and identified 2 sections of the property that could support additional revenue if handled correctly. She'd also been corresponding with Clara Mendez about the territorial investigation. The investigation had moved faster than expected, primarily because Oakes had given them not just testimony, but records. He'd kept meticulous records the way careful men sometimes do when they're doing something they know is wrong, as if the documentation is a kind of insurance or a kind of confession held for a future they can't quite see. Those records had opened up the pattern completely. 5 families, including the Hargroves. Fraudulent documents in 4 of the 5 cases. The Pruitt fire had moved into its own investigation stream, handled by the marshal's office directly. Vance's lawyer had filed every delay available, but the withdrawing of the lien enforcement done formally documented had been received by the territorial court as a significant indicator. Clara said it wouldn't reduce what was coming. It might, she said, reflect on the sentencing calculation if it came to that. It was the one thing Vance had done in his own direction. Ethan wasn't sure what to make of that. He thought about Ruth Hargrove's roses occasionally in the way you think about things that don't fit neatly into any category you have for them. The morning the debt cleared was a Tuesday. Garrett's letter arrived with the morning rider, and Martha read it at the kitchen table before anyone else was up. And by the time William came in for breakfast, she had the letter sitting in the center of the table and a cup of coffee already poured. He read the letter. Read it again. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. William sat down. He looked at the letter for a long time. Then he looked at his daughter. Really looked at her the way a person does when they're trying to see someone they've known all their life as the person that person has become. "Martha," he said. Papa, she said. I should have. I know, she said. I should have asked you. Should have told you. Should have. I know, she said again, not cutting him off, just receiving it, the way she received most things, with the calm, clear-eyed steadiness of a woman who had decided that carrying old grievances was a weight she could put down. I know, and I know you know. That's enough, Papa. That's enough for now. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She let him. They sat like that in the quiet kitchen, and outside the sun was coming up over the eastern ridge, and in the distance Ethan could hear the sound of the ranch beginning its day horses in the barn. A hand calling out to another, the ordinary sounds of a working property that was still after everything standing. He was at the water trough when Martha came out. She had the letter in her hand. She walked across the yard and stopped a few feet from him and held it up. Done, she said. Congratulations, he said. She lowered the letter. She looked at him with the direct, measuring gaze, and in it he could see something he hadn't seen in quite this configuration before. Not the carefulness, not the control, but something underneath both of those. Something that had been there all along, he suspected, and was only now close enough to the surface to be legible. I need to ask you something, she said. All right, he said. When you took the job, she said carefully. You said all right to the job, and all right to the clarification that it wasn't anything else. I did, he said. I want to revisit the second all right, she said. He looked at her. She met his eyes without flinching, without theater, without anything except the straightforward courage of a woman who had learned over the past 3 months that saying the thing directly was almost always better than the alternative. I'm not asking you to make a declaration, she said. I'm asking you whether the second all right is still your position, or whether... She paused just briefly, and in the pause, he could see the only moment of vulnerability she was going to allow herself, whether something has changed. He was quiet, not because he didn't know, because he was trying to find the right words for something he'd been thinking about for 3 months, on ranges and fence lines, and in the early mornings before the ranch came awake, thinking about what it meant to stop moving. What it meant to let a place become the place. What it meant to look at a person every day and find that the looking never became ordinary. Something has changed, he said. She held his gaze. What has... I don't want to leave, he said. Not because there's more work. Not because the situation isn't resolved. Because... He stopped, started again. Because I wake up in the morning, and the first thing I think about is whether you've already read the ledger, or whether there's still time to have coffee before you start. He paused. That's new. For me. That's not something I've had in a long time. Martha was very still. That's a small thing to base something on, she said finally. Maybe, he said. But it's a true thing, and in my experience, true things are the only ones worth basing anything on. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was full now, clear and warm, and in it she looked exactly like what she was, a woman of 23 who had been through something enormous and had come out of it more herself than she'd gone in, and who was now standing in her own yard on her own land with her own name and making her own choices. I'm not easy, she said. I want to be clear about that. I have opinions about everything, and I'll tell you when you're wrong, and I'll run these books the way I see fit, and I won't... She paused. I won't shrink. Not for anybody. Not anymore. I know, he said. You know now, she said. But in 6 months... Martha, he said. She stopped. I stopped my horse, he said, because you were sitting in the dirt and you didn't ask for help. I came back because I couldn't make myself not come back. I stayed because every day I found a new reason, and none of them were small. He looked at her directly. I'm not asking you to be easy. I'm not asking you to be anything except what you are. What you are is... He stopped. Found the word. Remarkable. And I've been pretending not to notice that for 3 months, because you told me not to, and I was trying to respect that. Something moved through her face that she didn't catch in time. She looked down at the letter in her hands, then up at him. I notice things too, she said quietly. "I've been noticing things for 3 months." "Like what?" he said. She almost smiled. Almost. The edge of it. "Like the fact that you always check on the north fence first in the morning, because that's the one that worries you, and you don't like to start the day with unfinished worry." She paused. "And that you drink your coffee too hot, and never complain about it. And that when my father says something that shows he's starting to understand what he put me through, you find a reason to leave the room so we can have the moment privately." She looked at him. "Those are small things, but they're true things." "Yes," he said. "They are." The morning stretched between them, warm and quiet, and full of the ordinary sounds of a ranch going about its work. "So?" she said. Not a question, more like a door opening. "So?" he said. She put the letter in her apron pocket. She looked at him once more with the clear, direct gaze that had looked at him across a dusty yard 3 months ago and seen someone worth paying attention to. "Coffee's on the stove," she said. "Come inside." He followed her across the yard and through the door, and the screen door closed behind him with the soft, familiar sound of a place that had become, without him, entirely deciding at home. By October, the investigation had reached the territorial court. The Hargroves came back to Mesilla for the preliminary hearings, Daniel Hargrove weathered and quiet, and Ruth, who wore a blue dress and sat in the courthouse with her hands in her lap, and listened to Oakes's recorded testimony with an expression Ethan couldn't fully read from across the room. After it was done, she walked out into the plaza and stood in the afternoon sun for a while, and then she turned to Clara Mendez and said something that made Clara nod. Martha was there that day. She walked across the plaza to Ruth Hargrove and introduced herself, and they stood together for a few minutes, and Ethan watched from a distance and did not try to hear what was said. Some conversations were not for witnesses. When Martha came back, her face was the quiet, resolved face of someone who has done a hard thing and found it was the right thing. "She's planting roses at her sister's place," Martha said. "The cuttings survived. She took them when they left." "Good," Ethan said. "She said she's glad someone finally looked," Martha said. "She said she always wondered why nobody ever looked." Ethan thought about a summer road and a woman sitting in the dirt and the particular way silence can be louder than any sound. "Somebody just had to stop long enough," he said. Martha looked at him. "You stopped," she said. "You made it worth stopping for," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she took his arm, not dramatically, not with declaration, just the simple, quiet gesture of a woman who has decided where she stands, and they walked back across the plaza together, toward where William was waiting with the wagon. Harold Vance's case moved through the territorial system for 2 more years. In the end, he lost the Pruitt case and the Hargrove case and paid restitution he could afford, but that cost him something more than money, the particular loss of the man who has been seen clearly and can no longer pretend otherwise. He kept his ranch. He became quiet. The county moved around him differently after that, the way water moves around a stone that is still there, but no longer the thing it was. The Caldwell Ranch cleared its debt by the end of October, 2 weeks ahead of Garrett's estimate. Martha presented the final accounting to her father and to Garrett over supper at the ranch table, and she did it with the composed precision she brought to everything column by column, clear and factual and complete. Garrett looked at the numbers and looked at her and said the way he said most things, direct and without ceremony, "Ben would have been proud." She received that without deflecting. "Thank you," she said, simply. The way a woman accepts something she's earned. That night, after Garrett left and William had gone to bed, and the ranch was quiet under the October stars, Martha sat on the porch with the account book closed in her lap and looked out at the land that was still here, still standing, still hers, in the way that a place becomes yours when you have fought for it with something real. Ethan sat beside her. "What are you thinking?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking about the woman who was sitting in the dirt in August," she said. 3 months ago, thinking the world had already decided what she was and where she was going to end up." She looked out at the dark. "I'm thinking about how wrong she was." "She wasn't wrong about everything," he said. "She was right that nobody was going to hand her anything." "No," Martha said. "Nobody handed me anything. I noticed that." She paused. "I took it. All of it. Every piece of ground I stand on right now I walk to." She turned and looked at him in the dark, and in her eyes was the whole of it, the summer and the dust and the courthouse and the ledger books, and the 3 months of ordinary mornings that had added up to something neither of them had planned. "Nobody gave me my life back." She turned back to the land. "I took it," she said, "and I'm not giving it back to anyone." The stars were enormous overhead, the way they were in the territory on clear October nights, and the land was quiet, and the ranch was standing, and Martha Caldwell sat in the dark with the account book in her lap, and her name in the county ledger, and her hand, after a moment, finding his on the porch rail between them. She had been sold like property discarded, like a problem overlooked like furniture, and erased like a word someone decided didn't belong in the sentence. And she had stood up anyway. Not because someone came to save her, because she decided in the dust and the heat and the silence of a summer that wanted to break her that she was worth standing for.